I'm pleased to welcome Rutledge. She's a former Moody's analyst and the founding principal of R&R Consulting, and is also the co-author of The Analysis of Structured Securities. Gives you a sense of her area of expertise. And glad you could be here. Let's try and establish something for our readers first. Just how unique was the AIG situation? Goldman created these CDOs. TCW, the former trust company of the West, a unit of Societe Generale, was hired to manage them. AIG underwrote the credit default swaps that insured them. But how common were CDOs like this, where you had these collateral swapping provisions?
This was a transaction that went out in 2004, Erik, and what is unique about this particular transaction is that a lot of data was available on it in Maiden Lane. But in fact, it was prototypical of a movement towards dynamic repackaging of residential mortgage-backed securities, RMBS, and it had many elements that we'd seen before.
So not entirely uncommon. It's just that the timing proved to be disastrous for AIG. Is that correct?
The timing was disastrous for AIG, and the timing was disastrous for many people, because in 2004, everybody had a different intuition about how residential mortgage-backed securities would perform. And they didn't really understand how, when you create the possibility of repackaging and replacing collateral in a repackaging structure like an RMBS CDO, and allowing people to actually take positions against the collateral that they were selling in securities, you created a recipe for an implosion, a gigantic implosion.
Well, now there's one problem with that, which is that if everybody's to blame, nobody is to blame. What should AIG have known about these CDOs and their propensity to turn into toxic waste?
AIG should have looked at the transaction structure to begin with. AIG should have considered what was going into it. You know, the Davis Square transaction was set up to replace up to 15% of the collateral every year. It was an actively managed transaction. It was a hedge fund, basically, that had a lot of provisions that AIG should have thought about.
Now let's talk about some of the other players here. Goldman Sachs, TCW, Societe Generale. We all know that Goldman and SocGen got paid out at 100 cents on the dollar when the Treasury Department took over the situation at AIG. What about the incentives here? The story makes a very persuasive case that the incentives were all wrong. But the securities were created by Goldman Sachs. Is there some evil genius element to this at Goldman, that these were designed from the very beginning to turn into sludge?
Well, there's no genius behind it. The fact is that these securities, the underlying, the RMBS, were created without the possibility of going back and seeing how they were performing. You put them into the market, you let them go, and if you structure them badly or you structure them well, that's the buyer's problem. It's not your problem. But there was 23 years of history of good performance of RMBS.
Well, as we know, it remains a vexing question. We're trying to do our best to help answer it. And thank you so very much. Rutledge of R&R Consulting, former credit analyst at Moody's.